Hello everyone, I am Officer Matthew Longshore, Public Information Officer for the Aurora Police Department. This video will provide you with information about a use of force incident involving officers attempting to arrest a suspect that tragically resulted in the suspect dying in our custody. The incident occurred December 17, 2018 at 10653 East Jewell Avenue. In a moment you will see body camera footage and hear 911 dispatch tapes that will help provide an accurate overview of what we have learned occurred during this incident. This specific case was investigated by our Major Crimes Homicide Unit in conjunction with the Denver Police Department at our request, as well as the Arapahoe County Coroner's Office, who did their own complete investigation. During the first part of the video, you will see officers deploying their tasers. During this first taser deployment, the taser projects skin-piercing probes that are meant to be embedded into the subject's skin, causing muscular disruption. Our taser systems only allow for one probe deployment at a time before needing a new cartridge. After the taser is deployed, officers now have to use a technique called drive stun, which will be the sparking noises that you hear during the video. This drive stun technique was attempted numerous times as a pain compliance, but you will see that it had little to no effect. It should be noted that although you are able to hear and sometimes see the taser sparking, not every time was there positive contact with the subject. A brief disclaimer: the content you are about to see may be disturbing to some viewers. When officers are put in a position that requires them to use physical force to effect an arrest or defend against an attack, the actions can be graphic and difficult to watch. In addition, the language heard in this video might be viewed as strong and offensive. Viewer discretion is advised.
I'm Nick Metz, Chief of Police with the Aurora Police Department. Today I will be providing you with a brief summary on an in-custody death that occurred on December 17, 2018. Before I show you this video, on behalf of the men and women of the Aurora Police Department, we extend our condolences to the family of Mr. David Baker. Our 911 Communication Center received a call at 6:14 p.m. regarding a physical domestic disturbance happening inside of an apartment. The caller called 911 to report a life-threatening emergency and stated that her sister-in-law's husband did not want to get out and that he was involved in a physical and verbal altercation with her brother. It is unknown how long the fight had been occurring before 911 was ever called. What you will hear next is the 911 recording.
911, reporting a life-threatening emergency. Hello, 911. Yes. What's the address of the emergency? 10653 East Jewell Avenue. Repeat that address. Aurora, Colorado. 10653 East Jewell Avenue. And what's the apartment number? G148. I'm sorry, what is it? G148. G148? Yes. What is your phone number? Maria. Maria, tell me exactly what happened. Her husband doesn't want to get out. I'm sorry, what? Her husband doesn't want to get out. Whose husband? My sister-in-law. Your sister-in-law's husband doesn't want to get out? Yeah. Or your sister's husband? Sister-in-law. So are they fighting? Yes. Okay, 1 second here. All right, and were weapons involved or mentioned? No. Does anyone have access to any weapons? No. All right, and is the disturbance physical or verbal? Both. All right, 1 second here. Where is he at right now? I need to get a description. What race is he? Black. And how old? 32. What's his first and last name? David Baker. What's his first name? David. Do you know his date of birth? Do you know his date of birth? No. All right, and what is your sister-in-law's race? She's 29. And what is her race? Hispanic. And what is her first and last name? What is her first and last name? Baker. What's her first name? Baker. Rachel? Baker. Can you spell the first name? I can't understand what you're saying. Maria, spell the first name for me. Baker. Spell it for me. B-A-I-S-Y. Are you or anyone else in danger right now? Yes, my kid. Your kid was? Yeah. And where are your kids at right now? Inside here. How old is each child? They're 20. How old are they? They're 20. How old did you say? I said there's plenty of kids. Oh, okay. All right. Don's coming already. Anyone involved in using alcohol or drugs? Go. Maria. Yes. Has anyone involved in using alcohol or drugs? No. Does anyone need medical attention? No. Yes. All right. If you can have them separate themselves and avoid further contact, we're going to have officers. Actually, officers are on the way. Call back immediately if anything changes, any further information. And you said that it's apartment 148, building G for George. So what's that? You said it's apartment 148, building G for George. Yes. Okay. They're on their way. Okay. Okay.
Initially, 3 officers arrived on the scene. What you are about to see are 3 different perspectives as they were recorded by each officer's body-worn camera. Officers arrived on scene at 6:23 p.m., approximately 7 minutes after the caller completed the call. We assume that during these 7 minutes, the fighting continued inside the residence, because when walking up to the apartment, officers could hear yelling and screaming coming from the area of which they were responding. As officers approach the front door, they look inside and can see a male actively choking another male. Officers begin to give verbal commands during this very loud and chaotic scene. One of the males then turns his attention to my officers and begins to advance on them. 2 different officers deployed their tasers once this male began to approach them, but neither taser had an effect on who we now know as Mr. David Baker. After 2 unsuccessful taser attempts, Mr. Baker pushes an officer out of the apartment and then falls on a different officer. After some baton strikes from one of the officers that proved to be ineffective, the fight then makes its way outside.
Stop! That's my brother!
Let him go.
Once the fight is outside, officers attempt to go hands-on with Mr. Baker to place him into custody. While trying to do this, Mr. Baker throws an officer to the ground, injuring her. Officers continue to give Mr. Baker verbal commands to stop resisting and to get on the ground, all of which are ignored. Mr. Baker continues to advance on the officers and ends up at one point grabbing one of the officers' baton. At this point, Mr. Baker and my officer begin struggling over control of that baton. Mr. Baker can be heard grunting and telling my officer to let go of the baton and that he's not playing. He refuses to obey commands given by the officers.
No, don't do that.
It's not working. No. 210, we need some more help. 210, we need some more help.
Get on the ground! Now! On the ground, dude.
Because of Mr. Baker's violent resistance and refusal to release the baton, a weapon that could potentially be used as a lethal weapon, one of the officers gets on the radio and called for help. Another officer who is in the position attempts to do a carotid control hold on Mr. Baker. While attempting to apply the carotid control hold, Mr. Baker is able to turn himself around and then places his hands around my officer's neck and begins to actively choke him. Noticing that the officer is being choked, one of my other officers attempts to drive stun Mr. Baker with their taser, but that does not work. The other officer attempts baton strikes to Mr. Baker's legs, but that also has no effect.
210, did you copy? We need more help. We need more help.
Let go.
210, people looking for help.
I'm not playing. In the name of Jesus.
210, we need more help. 210, we need more help.
I'm not playing. I'm not playing.
Hey, Store, can you get up?
210 calling for help at 1065 East Avenue. Building G, on
Get on the ground
Don't
now.
do it. I'm telling you.
Do it. Stop resisting. Stop resisting.
Mr. Baker was choking my officer for several seconds and eventually let go of my officer's throat and begins to walk towards the open door of the apartment. Someone on the inside of the apartment notices this and quickly closes the door. Mrs. Baker is left outside pleading to Mr. Baker to please stop. Mr. Baker continues to ignore officers' commands to get on the ground. My officer attempts to de-escalate the situation by putting away his baton and going hands-on instead. When attempting to gain control of Mr. Baker's arm and take him to the ground, Mr. Baker is able to fight through and continues to fight my officers. Officers begin to punch, kick, and use their taser to drive stun Mr. Baker in an attempt to gain control. It was ineffective. Mrs. Baker, as well as a neighbor who was heard yelling and screaming, pleading to Mr. Baker to stop fighting.
Get on the ground! Get on the ground!
You got it.
211
Get on the ground! Get on the ground!
You got it.
David, please! Do it for your son! Stop!
Get on the ground! Right now! Still waiting for a second. Get on the ground!
You want to keep doing this, man.
Please, David! Please! Do it for your son, please!
You don't want to keep doing this.
Please! Do it for your son!
Clark, you got another jurisdiction that's close up still ways off.
Please do it for your son!
Get on the ground!
Please!
You need to stop.
David, stop!
There's a lot more people coming.
Please!
Right now.
Stop! David!
Get on the phone.
Right now. Swear to God. Get on the ground!
You let go first.
Get on the ground! You better stop fighting. You better fucking stop fighting right now.
On the ground.
You see this?
come here. Help me. Help me.
Get on the ground! Get on the ground!
Help me!
Stop it!
Help!
Get
Help!
back up.
Help!
Stop it!
Help! 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 Help!
Baby, stop!
Stop!
Help!
Stop!
Help! Help!
Stop!
Help!
Stop it!
Get on the ground! I hurt you because you're being resistant. Stop! That's it. Don't fight them. They have high power.
Stop!
Stop! Listen. That's it. See, that's how we get you. We don't we want to fight. Don't fight. They're helping us. Stop! Stop! Just get handcuffed, go to jail. You're making it worse. You don't have to fight them. They're outside.
Excuse form 2. Pull up server. Filling out copy video after on server.
Yeah. Come on.
At this point, we are 6 minutes into the fight. My officers are obviously exhibiting signs of exhaustion. Mr. Baker is also exhibiting signs of exhaustion, not only from the fight between him and the officers, but also combine that with the fight with the family member prior to officers arriving. Mr. Baker is finally taken to the ground, but continues to fight and kick officers as they attempt to place him into custody. Officers begin to gain control of both Mr. Baker's arms, which he has buried under him, but they are having a difficult time due to his large size. One of the officers has to use his baton as a pry tool to get one of his arms free in order to handcuff him. Once Mr. Baker's second arm is free, officers begin to put handcuffs on him. It should be noted that it takes 4 pairs of handcuffs, all linked together, to successfully restrain Mr. Baker.
Come on in. Come on in, baby.
Where's his head?
Somewhere up that way.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
It's not that close.
No.
What do you got, an arm? Where's another arm? His arm is under him. Yeah.
I got his other leg.
Arms under him. Arms under him.
Give it that arm.
I got this other leg.
Left arm is buried under him. Weapon? No.
No weapon.
No. No weapon.
Left.
He's a big motherfucker and he's on something. Got it?
He can't get up. We gotta get it with him on. Don't get up. All right. I got his arm over here. Okay. He ain't going anywhere.
Hold on, I get a hand on it.
I'm gonna get this.
Okay.
Under.
You're over. You're over.
Got an arm. Turn that. Come on, turn that arm. Turn that. It's right here, under his leg.
Okay, you got it.
Awesome. Awesome.
Four on him. Nope, right here.
All right, nice and slow. Where are we taking him?
Is he cuffed?
Yeah.
He is cuffed.
But it's got like 3 or 4. He's got 4 on, so he can still move a little bit.
And
Even after being handcuffed, Mr. Baker continues to kick at officers. An officer then inquires about the use of a hobble. Officers prepare to apply a hobble, which consists of a separate waist chain and feet restraints. At no time during a hobble do the hands ever get attached to the feet, as they would in a hog tie. It should be noted that a hog tie is not allowed as a restraining tool in the Aurora Police Department. Also, while officers only mentioned applying hobbles, neither the separate waist chain nor the feet restraints were ever successfully applied. An officer goes back into the apartment to continue their investigation, and you can hear the original male who was being choked when officers arrived to describe the events to the officers. This male informs officers that Mr. Baker was trying to hold them all hostage and then describes being attacked by Mr. Baker.
Move a little bit.
And
Who's got hobbles?
I got some. My inner leg, right here. See him? Right here.
You get switched out?
It's in a pouch. Got that? Okay.
Yeah, Mason, we got his legs. You're good.
Before I moved, where's this taser pull? Was it in my hand?
I think it's in the chest was one of them.
Christy.
Okay, we just gotta wrap his legs.
All right, go for it, dog.
Hold on.
Give me what?
Give me a light.
Contact victims.
Yeah.
Bend on his legs, though. You can let go of his head.
Get off, turn around, put your knees between his head.
Rosamond, are you ready for
Put your knees between his head and just sit there.
He's got this probe.
You guys got enough people inside?
One more.
Can I have one more guy go inside, please?
Oh, you're good. Trying to hold us hostage and whatnot. Like, what thing here is right away as soon as I step the door, he just attacks me.
Your wife called you and said, so he's very correct.
Who else do we need to talk to? Who else do we need to contact here, guys? Is there all...
As officers continue to effectively gain complete control of Mr. Baker, an officer recognizes that he may be unconscious. Officers advise dispatch that they are ready for Aurora Fire and Rescue, who is staged around the corner to respond into the scene. Officers are still in the apartment interviewing the residents when the male from earlier describes in detail how he was being choked by Mr. Baker. As the officer walks back outside, officers are beginning to check on vital signs of Mr. Baker. An officer observes that they do not believe that Mr. Baker is breathing, but a different officer can feel a pulse.
Contact here, guys. Is there all in the apartment?
There's a female standing.
Was she the one in the white top?
No, he's not. We just didn't get around.
I don't think our people, I think our people are good.
I think so. I took a couple shots from you, I think.
Are you okay?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah.
Everybody okay?
He looks unconscious.
Good.
Ready for rescue?
There's probably loose probes like all over the place. Just be careful. Is that room clear? Yeah.
Put it over my head.
He was almost like getting choked. He was like
Over here, fucking just trying to save my life. My sister and my girlfriend are over here trying to save my ass. You know, fucking grown asshole.
Yeah, he's been batoned multiple times, tased. I don't know, did you OC him?
Seriously, where's the,
OC wouldn't work for some reason. I don't know what the problem is.
What are you looking for, Solar?
breathing now, guys? Yes or no?
No breathing. I guess I don't feel
Blink the 14. Yeah, you may ask you to step it up, please.
I'm not really feeling anything. I'm not feeling anything. Yeah, we have a pulse, but no breathing.
He took everything.
Yeah, everything. Everything.
As you guys, every time you get in here, we block all of our cars.
Well, let's get him on his back. Who's got gloves on?
An officer begins chest compression but is told that Mr. Baker is not breathing and to instead check his airway since they felt a pulse. Fire rescue is eventually led into the scene on foot by officers and take over for the care of Mr. Baker. Mr. Baker is transported to the hospital where he succumbs to his injuries.
Yeah, don't put. I have gloves too, Roosevelt, so when you need to switch.
Make sure his airway's open.
Well, you'll circulate air in the blood if you he's not breathing.
How far out are they?
Members of the Aurora Police Department's Major Crimes Homicide Unit responded to the scene and requested assistance from the Denver Police Department to complete a thorough and complete investigation. They were also assisted by the Arapahoe County Coroner's Office. The facts of the case were then presented to the 18th Judicial District Attorney's Office, who after review ultimately concluded that no member of the Aurora Police Department violated any Colorado statute with respect to the events that occurred at 10653 East Jewell on December 17th, 2018. This case is now being reviewed by our Force Review Board to determine if there were any policy violations. As you've been able to see from the body-worn footage, this was an incredibly violent fight between Mr. Baker and the officers. A fight that started well before officers arrived and continued for approximately 9 minutes once my officers did arrive. My officers did not have the option to just get up and walk away from the fight. Officers observed a male being physically choked, which is a felony. It is the duty of the officers to place this male into custody to further prevent any other crimes from occurring and to protect the family who was present at the time. As Chief of Police of the Aurora Police Department, it is my responsibility and my charge to make sure that every single incident, a critical incident, that involves my officers and the death of one of my community members, that we take these very seriously and that we conduct a very thorough and transparent investigation, and that we also look at our policy and our training to see if there's anything that we need to do different to do what we can to minimize anything like this from happening again in the future. Again, on behalf of the men and women of the Aurora Police Department, I want to express to the family of Mr. David Baker our sincerest condolences. Thank you for taking the time to review this video.